but thank you for joining this session on water, rising up the agenda, mapping water risk and the priorities for collective action. Next slide, please. So before we go any further, people who've been to RAP meetings before will know we have to just talk through the housekeeping. So the Chatham House rule, which is a rule or principle according to which information disclosed during a meeting may be reported by those present, but the source of that information may not be explicitly or implicitly identified. And then something we take really seriously so that we can all come together and share information safely is the competition law that we abide by. So we agree to conduct this summit in a competition compliant manner, which will not involve any discussions, decisions or subsequent behavioural change that may be construed as anti-competitive, nor shall we act in a manner that could be construed as advertising or promoting our own business or business concerns or soliciting for business or work. Competition law concerns can arise in a number of ways, including from the exchange of commercially sensitive information, from an agreement or a more general understanding, or decisions to boycott or to refuse to deal with certain businesses, agreements amongst competitors to impose unfair trading terms, as well as agreements which fix prices or which otherwise limit output and supply. Failure to adhere to these conditions will result in the premature termination of the webinar. So just needed to make you aware of that before we go any further. Next slide, please. So today we're just going to talk through what we're doing on water and why we're doing it. Then we're going to hear from Connor Linstead at WWF, who's been really closely involved on all of this, on how to get started on things like water risk mapping and how to kind of learn more about water stewardship. We'll have a short Q&A, and then we'll hear from Alex Adam, who's also been very closely involved with the Rivers Trust on the Cabot Agricultural Hub, which is a great source of information. And Q&A after that again, and then we'll be talking through the priority areas for action. And we'll have time at the end for more questions. So throughout the day, if you could just add any questions in the chat or in the Q&A function, that would be fantastic. So next slide, please. So why are we working on water now? I think, you know, there are some quite scary stats on the screen, but the FAO, the UN, the Environment Agency have all warned that urgent action is needed on water. Global water demand is set to double by 2030, and at the same time we have the UN predicting a water shortfall of 40% in the same time frame. The Environment Agency is also warning of serious water shortages in the UK if no action is taken. And in England, you know, only 14% of rivers are in good ecological health, and actually overall none of our rivers are in kind of overall good health, and that, you know, is really kind of important. And I don't know if you've read the State of Our Rivers report from the Rivers Trust, but it's very important reading. And in relation to this, when we think about the UK food and drink industry, you know, globally agriculture is responsible for 70% of freshwater withdrawals. 90% of the fruit that we consume in the UK comes from overseas, often from drought-prone areas. So we feel we're in a position to really help the UK food and drink industry take action on this really important issue. It's critical to mitigating climate risk in the supply chain, and it contributes towards the UN Sustainable Development Goal 6. Next slide, please. What are we trying to achieve on water? Well, we're working with the UK food and drink industry to improve the quality and availability of water in 20 of the most important product and ingredient sourcing areas in the UK and overseas. We want to have 20 of our collective action projects on water stewardship up and running by 2030. And overall, we want to enable the UK food and drink industry to source 50% of fresh food from areas with sustainable water management by 2030. Next slide, please. So how are we going to achieve that? Well, we've already launched our water roadmap last year, which many of you supported, so thank you. This sets out the key milestones and the key actions that we want the UK food and drink business industry to take, including securing commitment from businesses to set water reduction targets and start risk mapping water stress hotspots in the supply chain. And that's why we've got Connor here today next, talking about risk mapping and how to get started on that. We also want to encourage businesses to participate in collective action projects on the ground in the UK and overseas. And this is a really important part of our work on water. And again, we're going to hear more about collective action projects and how to get involved and which sourcing areas we're going to be kind of looking at and how we're selecting those areas for action going forwards. Next slide, please. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Connor Linstead from the WWF to talk through how to get started on water risk mapping. Thanks,
Great.
Connor.
Thanks, Rowan. So as Rowan said, I'm just going to focus a little bit today on businesses that are maybe new to water stewardship and new to the water roadmap, just to give some pointers on how to get started. Next slide, please. So, I mean, I guess there are three things really for a business coming to this fresh really to focus on. So firstly is mapping operations and supply chains. So literally, I mean, putting points on a map where you've got sites or growers or suppliers at quite a fine resolution. So if you're thinking about agriculture, it really has to be at the kind of farm level. And I think this isn't just useful, I think, for kind of water related initiatives and processes. There's a lot of other things happening in the wider environmental space that is going to need this kind of level of supply chain mapping. So things like science-based targets for nature, the task force for nature-related financial disclosures, all of which will need this kind of precision around mapping supply chains. And I think, I mean, certainly there are some difficulties. I mean, different businesses in different parts of the sector will face different challenges around doing this. You know, if you've got a very dynamic supply chain, it might be that you can just get a snapshot in time. I think that's okay to do that. We need to start somewhere to understand where the footprint of the business is globally or within the UK, which catchments you really need to focus on. I mean, if you're dealing with commodities, it becomes a little bit more tricky because you can't get that kind of fine level precision on supply chains. But there are ways of doing it, you know, looking at maps of crop distribution, for example. And I think Rowan's going to speak a bit later about how we're using that kind of approach to come up with our 20 locations as part of the water roadmap. I think the second key step is then assessing water risk and understanding the context of those sites. And there are several tools out there to do this. So one of which is WWF's water risk filter, which I'll just talk through very briefly in a second. But there are others, like the World Resources Institute have a tool called Aqueduct. And Alex is going to speak a bit later about the Farm Advice Hub, which does this kind of thing for within England. What any of these tools do really is they give you for your points that you've mapped, they will give you your the relative risk of those points. So, and that could be in terms of the physical water risk, so the scarcity and water quality aspects. It could be around the regulatory risk, so how good is the water management in those areas. And it could be about reputational risk. So what's the risk because of particular issues that are in those places? And you know, we've all seen the media articles about different crops and different places coming under the spotlight. So particularly Doñana in Spain at the moment, for example. What those tools do though is that they give you this point level risk, but they don't relate it to the materiality for the business. So there's a kind of second step to applying all these tools. So you get your water risk, but then you have to understand, well, what does that actually mean for the specific business that you're in? So you need to look at, where you might have clusters of suppliers in high risk areas, where you've got you're particularly exposed in terms of the value. So maybe particular crops or particular supply chains have greater value. They mightn't be the highest water risk, but they're the ones that you really need to address. Or there could be key products, so crops or raw materials that you just can't do without. So you need to focus there. So there's a sort of an absolute kind of technical scientific risk part, but then there's also what does that mean in terms of the materiality for the business? And once you've done those two, you can then think about, well, what are your priority locations? What countries do you need to focus on within those countries, the specific regions and specific catchments that you need to think about in order to progress to the third stage, which is around collective action. So what do you do for collective action? Well, you need to just join a project with others. So as we're talking today, we're aiming this today mostly at businesses that are quite new to this. So in that case, the recommendation would be you'll find a project in the area you're working in and take part in that. If there aren't existing projects in areas which are major priorities for your business, then you might think about how to start a new collective action project in your priority places. That requires a little bit more effort and a little bit more. It's a little bit more advanced maybe, but do bear in mind that through the WRAP water roadmap, there's a lot of backup that you can get, and I'll cover some of that in a slide later on. Or indeed, you can look at other third-party projects. So outside the whole water roadmap process, or even outside UK business initiatives. So there's something called the Water Action Hub, which is something that's set up by the Pacific Institute, I think. And they basically, it's an open source mapping of different projects in different locations. And within the water roadmap, we have a set of criteria that will allow us to say, well, if you do this third-party project, does it actually meet the criteria of what we're trying to do, the objectives of what we're trying to do under the water roadmap? So those, I think, are the three key things to keep in mind: mapping, assessing risk, and then joining collective action projects. There are other aspects to water stewardship and business engagement on water that we haven't really covered here, because they're not really in the scope of what we're trying to do under the roadmap. So I'm thinking about sort of more corporate level engagement on water. So science-based targets, contextual targets at a corporate or business level, developing a water strategy. How does the AWS, so the Alliance for Water Stewardship standard, fit into that strategy? So when you've got your particular sites where you want to ensure that you've got the credible water stewardship happening, then you need to think about how you implement the AWS standard. And then disclosure mechanisms through, for example, CDP. So those are other aspects that we're not really going to cover today, but I thought I'd just flag that they are sort of there as a part of the wider water stewardship context. Next slide, please. So in terms of the water risk filter, so this is a tool that we have developed at WWF. It's regularly updated, and the idea is that it will give you, for when you've got multiple, a big portfolio of sites that you need to understand the relative risk on, it will answer that question: where do you need to focus, which of the ones are at most risk. So it's essentially a spatial data tool. So we've got maybe 35 different layers of water related information in there. They're all open source or referenced, so it's all and peer reviewed, so it's all the best data that we can get hold of at the moment, and it's regularly updated as new data sources become available. So essentially, when you put your point on a map, it queries all of those data layers and aggregates a score and tells you what's the water risk at that location. It's a free tool to use, so you can just set up an account, upload your data, and that will give you a risk score straight away. And you can also look at the categories of risk. So are you more exposed on water scarcity or water quality or reputational risks or regulatory risks? Next slide, please. Next picture. So this is the just an example of the kind of output that you get. So it will give you a dashboard showing you how many sites, what's the proportion of sites in different areas of water risk, how do they compare against each other, so which are the ones that you need to really focus on, and gives you a geographical split as well, but you can see that on the map tools that we've got within the risk filter as well. So next slide, please. One of the things, so we did an update towards the end of last year on it, and we've now incorporated climate change risk in there as well. So what is the additional water risk that an individual site will be exposed to under climate change? So you can look at 3 different scenarios: what an optimistic current trend and pessimistic scenario, and out to 2030 and 2050. So you can see which sites, where do you need to start thinking about the future change in water risk because of climate. Next slide, please. And then, getting data into it is very, very simple. There's a dialog box that you can put in if it needs very limited information. So you just need to give your site a name, what industry you're in. So if you're in the food sector, it could be food manufacturing, or if it's crop production, you also put in the type of crop that you've got that you're sourcing from that site. How important is it in terms of your materiality to your business and its location? So you can put in an address and it will do an automatic search for that site. But it's better if you've done the mapping, to put in it as geographical coordinates. Next slide, please. If you've got lots of sites, that can be quite a tedious process to do through that dialog box entry. So there is a template, so an Excel spreadsheet. You basically just format all your data in that Excel spreadsheet with the coordinates and all those other categories and upload it. And you can upload thousands of sites at once. So it's a very simple process to do that. Okay, thanks. Next slide, please. And then, so the third aspect of where to start. So we've covered mapping data, water risk data, and then collective action. So what does it actually mean in terms for a business to join a collective action project? So the 3 things, I think. So one is funding. That's always really important to actually get stuff done on the ground. One of the common themes that we've seen across all of the projects, I think both the ones in the UK, but also the international ones, is that we need a person. We need to be able to provide the resources to employ someone to act as a coordinator in a location, so they can really understand what the issues are in that place in some detail and build up relationships with local stakeholders. So that's key, I think, and that those catchment coordinators or farm advisors, or however we call them, the key thing that they can do is also leverage in additional funding. So that's if you're thinking about government funding or research funding or development donor funding. So that's a function. So with a relatively small investment from individual businesses, you can actually leverage quite a lot of funding. And then that can deliver against all those project activities. The other key thing is getting business buy-in, or buy-in from the wider business into the shared goals of the project. So in each place where we're doing a collective action project, the specific things we're doing are going to vary depending on the context. So it could be, diffuse pollution from agriculture is an important thing, or in Spain it could be illegal abstractions. In South Africa it's invasive species clearance. But we've arrived at these activities and the goals based on a technical scoping analysis of those places. So they're really well grounded in terms of the technical side of the technical scientific rationale for what we're doing in those places. So, and I guess that the third important part of business buy-in is getting buy-in to the advocacy asks, because this can be quite a new area and quite a daunting area for a lot of businesses. And this is where we identify failings in, or not failing, but things we want to change around the water management at a catchment level, and things we want to press government institutions, water management institutions, politicians to change. And that's something that really needs a lot of careful thought within a business about whether you're committed to doing that. So that's kind of critical. And then the third thing that we would ask in terms of what a business does in a collective action project is communication, and that's communication to your supply chain in the project area. That can be around explaining the rationale for why we're doing the things we're doing, the kind of the technical scoping analysis that we've done to arrive at those conclusions, and encourage participation of your supply chain. And this can, again, it varies from place to place depending on what the specific issue is, but it could be arranging for access for an invasive species clearance team in South Africa. So asking whether we can, engage with a particular landholder to get access to do that. It could be training for standards auditors on identifying illegal abstractions. It could be getting access to a farm advisor to develop a farm plan and implementation of that farm plan. So those are the types of things we're talking about. Next slide, please. So I think I've actually run out of time, so I'm just going to very quickly say on this slide. So the water roadmap, I think, is, so as we operate as a global network in WWF, we see quite a lot of initiatives around water stewardship globally, and I really do think that the water roadmap is a globally leading example of businesses coming together to do this. And the framework that we set up through the roadmap is it provides a really easy entry point for businesses on water issues. And there's a whole number of advantages to doing that collectively. So I would just urge you all just to reach out if you're new to this and contact us, and we will support you in that process. Thanks, Rowan. That's me done.
So Alex, over to you.
Thanks, Rowan. Morning all. I'm just going to give a 15-minute overview of the Cabra Agricultural Hub, how we've got to this point, what it is and how it might be useful to your business, and really how it might support your journey around water stewardship. So next slide, please. I start all the presentations off with this map, which kind of gives a really good overview of the river network and catchments across the UK. And I think it really helps to illustrate the fact that, anything that we do on our land ultimately ends up in our rivers. So if we want to improve water quality, we need to start thinking about the rivers and the land that surrounds them, that then brings us into this sort of catchment related space. And through doing that, just to stress the point that actually you can address a whole load of other sort of ESG, CSR type of commitments. So if you look at things through a water lens at that local level, not only do you get that sort of locally relevant target, but the kind of mitigation and the resilience aspects that can be achieved are quite considerable. And it also really starts to align or create a golden thread through a whole load of other CSR objectives. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So within that catchment context, I think it's really important to note that there are already in England anyway, 105 catchment partnerships. So these are groups of organisations, individuals, farmers, NGOs, regulators who are already working at a catchment level to kind of coordinate and integrate and develop more sort of aligned plans. So, going back to the point that Connor made earlier about building on existing best practice, there are already some well-established catchment partnerships in the UK, and certainly the work that we've been doing in the UK projects or the England projects is building on the work of the existing catchment partnerships. There are different levels of maturity and sophistication. So, you know, and we've got particular pilot projects, but again, any businesses who are working in a particular area, I'd recommend getting in touch with the catchment partnership or getting in touch with myself, and I can help facilitate that. Let's move on, please. Next slide. So we won't go into any detail on this because we don't have time, but I'm sure many will already be aware that we've been developing pilot or pathfinder projects around Courtauld 2025 and now 2030. Map on the right illustrates sort of some of the areas that we've been working in, some of the kind of key sourcing requirements and some of the challenges. This map, as always, is not quite up to date, but you know, through the collective action projects that we've done thus far, we've learnt a lot. Not all, we haven't done everything right, it's fair to say, but we have done quite a lot right. But through that focused area and that collaborative action, we delivered 3 new catchment business boards, so trying to bring those businesses together in an area to meet on a regular basis to understand collective issues and actions. We've generated some direct funding, which is great, but more interestingly, particularly for yourselves, is the amount of leverage funding that's then created. Again, these figures are out of date, but interestingly, the work that we've been doing through farmers has then leveraged an additional 15 million or so via countryside stewardship to support interventions and mitigations on the ground. Lots of farmers involved, quite a few trees being planted, because actually if you start working at catchment scale and you start to identify flood risks, well actually you can start to put the right trees in the right place to reduce flood risk to your operation, so you can start to see where this can all join up on the ground. And we're also using a replenish methodology to measure outcomes, which again, it's probably just worth noting that it's a pretty robust methodology. It's been used by quite a few corporates over the years, particularly Coke, PepsiCo, and a growing number of others. But this is a methodology for managing land use change for the benefit of water. So, for example, putting cover crops in will have a replenished value, planting trees, putting in a wetland. So all these kind of interventions we can then measure both from a water quality or water benefit perspective, but also wider biodiversity, carbon associated benefits. So that's just some of the work. What I'm going to cover off now is some of the learnings and some of the tools that we developed on the back of this work. So next slide, please. So one of the things that became apparent quite early on in our sort of pilot projects is the fact that there's quite a lot that's going on. This is not just through Courtauld, but kind of wider collective action. There's a lot going on, but sometimes it's very difficult to understand, certainly at a sort of macro level, who's doing what where, who's offering advice, what's the funding available, what information is there out there. And there's a lot of information, but not necessarily particularly accessible or scattered to the four corners. What data? There's a load of data, but again, it's not all readily accessible. So what we've tried to do is bring all these bits together into a simple one-stop shop type of tool that works for both farmers, agriculture advisors, local groups, so catchment partnerships, local nature partnerships, others, but also businesses, to help you better understand where the risks and opportunities are within your supply chains in associated or related to water. So this is just a simple schematic saying how we're trying to join up these dots. I'm going to cover off some of the functionality in the tool in the next few slides. So next slide, please. So I have to stress, this is still a beta. It is live, and there's a link at the end of these slides, but it is still in development. It will continue to develop, and we need to get more people using it and populating it with more information, because that in turn will create more value. But this is just a screenshot of the home slide, home page. There are 3 bits of functionality. One is about creating connections. So who's doing what where, what initiatives are having where, how do we foster that greater collaboration on the ground? Data and information, how do we make that data more readily available to everybody? It's out there, it can be a bit overwhelming and a bit daunting, but we try to kind of collate and curate that information so it's meaningful and accessible. And it's worth noting that all the data that we've used on here also is the same set of data that's in the WWF water risk filter, but this is at a more granular level. And then there's guidance and best practice, and this will continue to grow. And there's loads of great tools and initiatives out there, but again, it's difficult to know what you don't know. So we're trying to kind of create signposting mechanisms around that. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to cover off sort of a few bits of functionality over the next few slides. So the first one is around farm advice, and there's two elements to this. There's, if you're an advisor, you can go on and you can register and you can say who you are, what type of advice you offer, is it free, is it paid for, what sector specialisms, etc. And at the moment, it's fair to say that whole advice networks, it's not as integrated as it might be, should we say. So we're creating this geospatial database where advisors from all walks can start to map what they're doing where, and then that allows both suppliers but also farmers to easily go onto the map and let's say I'm in this part of the country, who's offering what advice. So we're building this database, it is growing and it will continue to grow over time. So that's sort of the connections in terms of farm advice project officer level. Next slide please. And then, as Connor already mentioned, you know, what we're trying to do through water stewardship and collaborative action is build on existing best practice. This is not about reinventing wheels. We haven't got time to reinvent wheels, and it doesn't really help anybody on the ground. But so it's about trying to understand what opportunities, both funding, initiatives are already happening. Certainly in England, there's an absolute plethora of grants available, projects on the ground, but it's very difficult to understand what's going on where. So again, we've created similar functionality where any user can go in and just have a look to see what's happening where, but equally project sponsors, initiators, you know, government funders. So I'm working with DEFRA to try and get them to put all their grants on here to start to give that better holistic overview of what's happening where, what the funding might be available, what projects might be happening on the ground. So again, really just to help try and join up the dots locally. Next slide, please. And again, similar with connections, case studies and demo farms. I've been in this sector for quite a while. There are absolutely thousands of demo farms out there, but there is no central database. So how do we create that? So single source of the truth. So it's easy for advisors, farmers from whatever sector, irrespective of the business or area of interest, can go on and actually understand where is best practice happening on the ground. And equally, can we start to create that library of case studies that are relevant to farmers, businesses and others. So we just done the sort of added functionality around that. Next slide, please. And again, sorry, this is Whistlestop. We don't really have time to go through the details, but just some contextual tools that we've got on the hub. So one's around farm context. So that's trying to understand, you can put a dot on the map, be it a farm or a business, which catchments you're in, what catchment drains down to that property, where does water from that property go in terms of the rivers, and that gives you links through to WFD status and some very high level information about the water related sort of issues and opportunities in the patch. We're going to go to the vulnerabilities and measures tool, which I'll go into a bit more detail on the next slide. But this is our first attempt, and I say it's under development, to allow you to kind of start to map your supply chains at quite a granular level within England. We are only doing this for England only at the moment. We're looking to develop for Scotland and Wales in time, subject to kind of appetite, funding, and all these other things. But that will effectively allow you to put in, at the moment, the dot on the map, but we're just building the functionality for postcodes, to put in the postcodes of all your supply chains, and that will create a sort of risk stroke opportunity table that gives you a very high level overview of what some of the risks and opportunities might be with that particular location. I have to stress this is based on geospatial data. It's not about farm practice, but it will give you a very high level overview to say, well, where in your supply chain might there be the highest water related risks that you're aware of? So if you wanted to look at the top 10, top 20%, whatever else it might be, this would be where to start. And then looking at the previous information, well, how might those 20 farms, argument's sake, relate to some of the local projects and advice, and how do we start to foster that greater collaboration? And then we've got data explorer tools which cover things like air quality, biodiversity, too much water, too little, flood risk, etc. So again, this is just contextual information that sort of allows you, advisors and farmers, to get a better understanding of some of the risks and opportunities. And then in time, once we've built the other bits of the functionality or populated the other databases, if you are in a, for example, flood risk area, or you are upstream of a flood risk area, or indeed downstream, can you click to the link and understand what funding opportunities or advice might be available to help mitigate against that? Let's move on, because I suspect I'm running out of time. So again, we're still work in progress, but this is just a snapshot of what the vulnerabilities and measure tool will do in terms of supply chain. So it's a bit crude at this stage, but we've got the reds, ambers and whites. So the reds would indicate where there are greater risks or issues related to be it water quality, low flow, well-being. So each row constitutes a location on the map, and that just gives you that ability to do a high ranking analysis of actually where are those sites where there might be the biggest risks in terms of flooding, water quality, etc. Again, as I say, this is still work in progress, but the reason we've developed this is because we were getting into a bit of a tangle in terms of supply chain mapping and numerous requests coming in from numerous different parties. And this just gives us that sort of ability for you guys to do that yourselves. But again, we're happy to offer support and advice where required. Let's move on. I think we've got one or two more slides. Again, guidance and best practice. There's loads out there. We probably don't need another soils guide, to be honest. There's hundreds out there. What we don't have is a central place where we can put all this best practice advice, particularly for farmers, together. So we're developing this library of links out to advice and additional tools, and this will grow over time. But again, this is very much from a farmer and advisor perspective. What are the different tools out there that you might be useful in terms of addressing water related risks and identifying opportunities? Let's move on, please. Next slide. So just final slide on this is really, that this project was initiated because it came about through the Courtauld, very much kind of initiated through the Tesco's WWF partnership and with additional support Cope. But I'm hugely pleased to say that, through the tool, we've had a growing number of supporters. So Pilgrims are now signed up. Woodland Trust are going to be using it because we're doing some related work in terms of trees and carbon. Waitrose is very pleased. M&S, Prince of Wales has been kind of critical supporters to this from the get-go. And we've recently just had further support from United Utilities, and I'm very confident that we will build further support for water companies over the coming months. Again, how do we bring the vested interests of different parties from different sectors together to start to address some of these challenges? And I think that's my last slide, but I'm not 100% sure. Should we click on to the next one? There you go.
Excellent, thanks.
Thanks, Alex. Right, we'll move on. So top marks for anyone who can spot where that photo's from. But yeah, very topical. And we're looking now at where we're going to focus action on. So those collective action projects that Connor and Alex talked about that are so vital to addressing water risk. Next slide, please. So just very briefly, why collective action on water? I think Connor and Alex have both explained this very well, but the power really is around water being that shared resource, and you can't really act on it alone in a catchment approach. So we take this landscape approach to it. That's really key. It's really key that we look at water not just in your own operations, but also across the supply chain. And it really is the proven way that we're going to see kind of meaningful impact on water risk. Next slide, please. So just looking at existing projects that, again, tried and tested and seeing great results. And all of these projects are still open to support. So we have 4 based mainly in England, but 1 bordering on the Welsh border, the Waun Usk. They're all kind of active projects now, but we're actively seeking greater levels of support and participation from business with all of those projects. And overseas, we're working with WWF in 3 key areas at the moment. So if you would like more information about how to get involved with any of these projects, just drop me an email. My email's in the chat, and we can discuss all of it. Next slide, please. So what are we doing next in terms of identifying this kind of top 20 list of sourcing areas that are key to UK food and drink? We're working with ADAS currently on a kind of research and analysis project to identify these areas. We're hoping to have that initial research complete by the end of March. And then we'll be looking to consult Courtauld signatories. That will be a really key part of the process to ensure that, as Connor discussed, we're getting this right for the UK food and drink industry, and we're selecting the areas that are of priority to them. Next, please. In the UK, the approach is very much kind of stakeholder led. So we're doing loads of work talking to the Rivers Trust. Obviously, Alex, as you've heard, you know, they have a whole bank of information that we can draw on. We're also consulting other stakeholders. We're very aware that at the moment the work to date has been quite focused on England, so we're just trying to broaden that out, and we have stakeholders from Wales, from Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland and Scotland that we're consulting with. And very much the focus is quite broad in the UK, so we're looking across livestock, we're looking across fruit and veg, and a whole range of products and ingredients. Next slide, please. Overseas, we're very much focused on fruit and veg, and ADAS is working on kind of collating data around the volumes of fresh produce that's imported against the WWF water risk filter data to inform prioritisation. Next slide, please. So you'll see here, this is just to give you a kind of taste of the kind of data that ADAS is working with to look at imports of fruit and veg into the UK. Next slide, please. And then mapping that against these key hotspots. This Morocco, just as an example, you can see how using the WWF water risk filter, we can really kind of drill down into where that UK attribution is and where we need to focus. Next slide, please. So in terms of further projects, the goal is to have 20 collective action projects up and running by 2030. We have, you know, once we have that list of sourcing areas, we can then work with water stewardship experts and on the ground delivery bodies like WWF and like the Rivers Trust and others to identify collective action projects that businesses can get involved in. There'll also be an ongoing open call to Courtauld signatories to inform this process, so it'll be quite iterative. You know, you can let us know if you've done some risk mapping and if you've identified water stress hotspots in your supply chain, then talk to us about it. You know, there might be others who want to work in that area. There might even be existing or planned projects that we can build on. And each project will develop and agree quite specific activities for that location. So as Connor and Alex both said, you know, collective action projects are very much catchment based and will address whatever urgent needs there are in that locality. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending today. I think we had a really good attendance actually, so we're really pleased, and we're looking forward to engaging with you all some more on all of this. But any questions, please do email me. Anything at all you're concerned about or you'd like more information on, I can help.